Connection, focusing on topics and issues that reach our communities with the love and the power of Jesus Christ.
Hello and welcome to Outreach Connection. My name is Sherry McDaniel, and I want to thank you for joining us on the program. You know, they told me when I came here that when I started hosting this program, that it was all about connections. And most certainly we have seen how true that is. But I want you to listen to some words that Jesus said, found in 1 John 3:18, and how he tells us to connect with people. It says, "Dear children, let us not love with words and speech, but with actions and in truth." And did you hear the action word? You know, it's one thing to tell somebody that you love them, and of course we should do that, but it's quite another when we show them how much that God loves them. Today we are going to talk about an event in our community's history where we all had an opportunity to connect with others and to reach out and to reach out and love and to help. And I want you to join me in welcoming our guest today, former Mayor Chuck Sholz, being on the program.
Thank you for having me, Sherry.
We're so glad that you came.
I'm glad to be here.
Now, we're talking about connections. And, you know, first and foremost is that connection with God, the love of God in each of our lives. But from an event that we all experienced back in 1993, talking about the flood of 1993 in our community, we saw connection that, you know, still gives me goosebumps when I talk about, or when I talk about it or remember. But for the few folks that maybe don't recognize your face before we get into that conversation, just share with us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I was born and raised here in Quincy and educated at St. Peter's and Christian Brothers, and went off and graduated from Georgetown University out in Washington. And then I got my law degree down in Georgia, where my dad and uncle and brother, we all went to Mercer University Law School, came back to practice law in Quincy with my dad. But I got involved in government as an assistant state's attorney. Then I was director of the Attorney General's regional office for 10 counties in Western Illinois, which was a great job for me, consumer protection and so forth. And then former United States Senator Paul Simon, who's a great man, great role model for me. He asked me to be his downstate political director. So I did that for his reelection campaign in 1990, came back practicing law again with Dad, and still wanted to be involved in public service, but the opportunities had all been Springfield, Washington, Chicago, and, you know, I was married, had 2 little boys at the time. They're all grown up now, but my wife and I are both really oriented to Quincy and our families, and I didn't want to leave. So some friends of mine suggested I run for mayor. And I did in 1993, and I was just full of vim and vigor about governmental type focus. And what I quickly learned was that's great, making sure the buses run on time and the fire department shifts are staffed and, you know, the airport is operational, but what's really important is what goes on outside City Hall and being a leader in the community. And I was sort of thrust into that because I took office in May, and in June we were confronted with the greatest natural disaster in the history of the upper Midwest.
Yes. And, you know, I did just a little research about, you know, all the tributaries that feed into the Mississippi River, and I'm hoping that I'm recalling this correctly, that there are thousands of tributaries that flow in from 31 different states and 2 Canadian provinces.
Wow.
Into
2/3 of the continent, basically.
Yes.
And that was something that was so evident that summer. It continued to rain here, but the real issue was what was happening in Wisconsin and in Iowa, for instance, because everything flows right by our doorstep here in Quincy. And one by one, we lost the levees at Lima Lake and then Indian Graves, and then, of course, the Snai, and eventually the Fabius across the river, which was really devastating because we knew, being up here on the 100-foot limestone bluff where our bridge touches down, we were fine in Quincy other than some riverfront impact. but the approach to the bridge ran through the bottoms in West Quincy, and if that levee was breached, then the approach would be inundated, and we would be severed, because that was the only bridge for 200 miles from St. Louis to Burlington, Iowa. We were it. And so that was a large part of our focus. We were sending sandbags with this amazing volunteer effort north to Nyota, south to Pleasant Hill. We even sent some east to the Illinois River, and certainly all over northeast Missouri. But it clearly became the focal point was we got to keep that bridge open. Yes. And it was quite a fight.
And you were instrumental in seeing that happen by sending equipment and sending crews from the city of Quincy, because you understood, the viability of the community and the effect that it would have not just on the farmers, but our entire tri-state area. And as you said, a 200-mile radius. But I think somewhere I read there were like 110,000 acres of land, 55,000, I think, just in our near community. But from like the first one basically that started at Alexandria that broke as they came down the river, and we would see a little bit of reprieve.
It would go down slightly as there was as the levee district would fill up and relieve the pressure, and then it would build back up. And that was different, Sherry. I've been born and raised here, as I said. We've been through a lot of floods. They typically would have a crest where we'd have a spike. This time the river got up, and it got up higher than it had ever been, and it stayed up.
Yes.
And it was relentless.
Yes.
And you have to respect the power of the Mississippi
powerful force
River
on the earth, actually.
But
water.
As you say, we made a decision, and at the time it was controversial. I can tell you, I had aldermen banging on my desk saying there's no way we'll ever send a city of Quincy employee outside of our city, and certainly not to another state. And I said, we have to, because of the point that you made. We are all in this together.
Yes.
And first of all, it's the right thing to do to help your friends and neighbors. Yes. But beyond that, we all have a stake in that. And the Knapheide plant at the time was over there. We had our farmers that bring their soybeans and corn to Quincy. So we made a decision. I declared a state of emergency, which allowed suspension of the 6 union contracts that we had, and we could focus on flood fighting. Everyone in any department was to respond to the flood fighting. And we decided we would open up Quincy University's stadium parking lot and go into the media and make a call for volunteers. And Sherry, we had no idea. I think back on how naive I was. I called our Central Services Director, Kenny Cantrell, and I said, how many sandbags have we got? This is early on. And he said, we've got 10,000. And I said, how many are you going to need for the water plant and wastewater? And he said, probably 5,000. I said, well, bring the other 5,000 out to Quincy University Stadium, because I'm going to ask for people to come out, and then we'll take the sandbags where they're needed, which was different than how we'd fought floods in the past. Yes. Typically, it was just out on the levee. But this was really going to be a new concept. So anyway, 5,000 bags did not go very far. At one point, we had Chinook helicopters bringing in 100,000 bags that they were, suspended beneath the chopper, and to drop it down. We had the Illinois Department of Transportation sent us trucks from over in central Illinois, from around Bloomington. So we had 16 trucks that could hold 14 tons of sand apiece. And we used all the sand we had at our local course. We were going down to Fall Creek. It was about an hour round trip. And these trucks would come in, and they would dump these mountains of sand. And these volunteers would attack those mountains. They'd leave to get more sand. When they came back in an hour, people were banging their shovels, wanting more sand. And it was juniors holding the bag, and dad's filling it up, and mom's tying it off. Yes. And we had factories shut down and say, go out to the sandbag. Yes. We had the park district would, instead of having a softball game, one side would see if they could make more sandbags than the other side. And if you couldn't make sandbags, senior citizens were making sandwiches. Yes. Little kids had wagons full of water that they were taking around to people. It was just an incredible sense of community. And the thing that you have to bear in mind is these are people that live up here on the bluff. They weren't threatened. Their house wasn't going to get flooded, but they wanted to do something. And, it's pretty hard for a family to go down into a drainage district or out on a levee, and it was dangerous. This was safe, and everybody could help and volunteer. So it became a phenomena, and the national media was all there, which was a great advertisement for our region, for the dedicated, dependable character of our workforce. And I've used that many times since in economic development to say that's why you ought to be in Quincy. These are the people that you're going to depend on. But we had the satellite trucks out there, ABC and NBC and CBS and CNN and whatever. And the story was, here's this community that's banded together to keep their bridge open. And we would have won that battle. I am convinced. I was over in West Quincy July 15th that night. In fact, I did a live shot from the levee on the local news, and I was as stunned as anyone when the next day, July 16th, 8:22 p.m., the levee was breached. Of course, we now found out it was sabotaged by a deranged individual who's now serving a life prison term in the state of Missouri. In their wisdom, actually has a criminal offense called causing a catastrophe. And
I believe he's the only one that has ever been convicted and serving for that.
It's the only one I've ever heard of. And he was a known arsonist. And when local law enforcement saw that he was on the scene, he was the first one interviewed live. They thought this cannot be a coincidence, and he ended up confessing, although now his story is that he didn't do it, but that's pretty common in Department of Corrections that nobody ever did it. But in any event, then we had to deal with the consequences, and that night we gathered in my office. I mentioned I'd worked for Paul Simon, so I was fortunate enough to have his cell phone. And there weren't many cell phones in those days. Bag phones, we had about three of them, I think. But in any event, I woke him up. And he had served in the House before he was elected to the Senate with Les Aspin, who was a congressman at that time from Wisconsin. Well, he was Secretary of Defense under President Clinton. So he said, absolutely, I'll help him. And he called the Secretary of Defense. And it wasn't too long that we heard the sound of a helicopter landing in City Hall parking lot, and I had a major general march into my office, and this is the middle of the night. This is probably 3 o'clock in the morning, but a number of local officials were there. We were all strategizing on what we were going to do, and I could tell he wasn't too happy. I was offering him coffee and thanking him, and he said, all he knew was somebody woke up the Secretary of Defense, and he turned out to be a great guy. And we worked together very well and became close and are still in touch. But at that time, it was a kind of a tense situation. We were trying to figure out what we could do it was a Friday night, between Friday night and Monday morning, because almost 40% of our economy comes across that bridge every day. People have to go to work. They have to go to the hospital. It was really a challenge. And, of course, we did all sorts of things with helicopter shuttle, fixed-wing aircraft. They were able to open for one lane at Keokuk by dumping a lot of rock onto the approach, putting pipes there, and then rock on top of that. But to get from, say, Taylor to Quincy, and we had all these tributaries that were out of their banks, to get all the way up to Keokuk and then go one lane in line. It was taking about 2 hours. It wasn't working. So after a few days, we came up with this idea for the boat shuttle. And Captain Bob Lump at that time operated the Hannibal Mark Twain excursion boat. So he was licensed to transport passengers on the Mississippi, and he offered his services. He located a couple of big flat pontoon boats that would be perfect for it. They had a little restroom on them, and we could use that for commuters. The problem we had was even though the Department of Transportations of both states and the federal government approved it, we could not get the Army Corps of Engineers I know you have some connections there, but it was very typical. I've dealt with the Corps many times over the years, but they like to do a study and proceed rather deliberately. Well, that's what I said. This is an emergency, and we got to get these people, and this is not working. And we had people camping out and all sorts of stories, but we wanted commerce and industry to continue. So I called Paul Simon again, and he said, I am in Chicago, and the president's going to be here, and we're going back to Washington, and I'm anticipating I'm going to be able to fly back on Air Force One with him. I don't know if I can speak to him directly, but certainly he'll have his senior staff there, and I'll talk to somebody. And I said, thank you so much. And that night, I got home. My wife and kids, like everybody else, was out at the sandbag site, filling sandbags. And you remember answering machines.
Yes, yes.
So it's about 11 o'clock at night, and I hit my answering machine, and first 3 messages were, it rained again, no soccer for Jake or whatever, just run of the mill. And then I heard this is the White House secure voice phone operator calling for Mayor Sholz. The president wishes to speak with you immediately. And I thought, oh my God, the president of the United States called me, and I missed it. So a couple more messages, and then this is the White House calling back for Mayor Sholz. The president's trying to reach immediately, and there was a number, and I called that number, but the operator said, what's your access code? And I said, well, ma'am, I don't have an access code, but I am returning the president's call. And obviously didn't believe me. And I said, well, maybe you've seen the news. There's this disaster. We're in the middle of it. I'm trying to reach the president, and it really wasn't cutting through. And I said, if you could just bear with me a second, because I'm not crazy. I'm going to play my answering machine for you. So she heard the messages about my son's soccer practice or whatever, but when it got to the White House security, she apologized profusely. And just in an instant, I get this, this is Red Crown. I'm switching, then I get this is Air Force One, please hold for the president, and I get the president. Mayor, I understand you got a problem. And I said, oh my gosh. But I had my notes from having talked to Senator Simon earlier in the day, so I knew exactly what it is we wanted authorized. And I went through that. I was trying to thank him and get off the phone, not wanting to be too presumptuous, but he said, oh, now hold on here. Your buddy wants to talk to you. Well, he handed the phone apparently to Paul Simon, who had a very distinctive baritone, deep voice, and he said, Chuck? And I said, yes, Paul. And he said, he always insisted on calling Paul, not Senator. He said, I really got you that time, didn't I? And I said, what do you mean, Paul? He said, well, doesn't that guy do a great Bill Clinton imitation? And I said, please, Paul. And he said, don't worry, that's the president.
That was really
He's going to help you. And the next morning at 7 a.m., Gary Sparks, who was Director of Administrative Services, and I had designated as flood coordinator, he shows up at my house, and I said, Sparky, I don't think our meeting is till 8 o'clock. And he said, that's all been changed. And I said, well, I think we're going to meet with MoDOT. He said, no, we're meeting with the Corps. And we rode out to a place we didn't even know they had an office rented out on North 24th, but it was full of Corps of Engineer people. But there was a young man there in combat fatigues, had the name stenciled, and he was totally in command. And he said, Mayor, give me one name, one cell phone, and tell me where you want to stage it. And I said, we want front in Hampshire, because our city buses will be able to pick people up and take them wherever they need to go to work. And Gary Sparks, I said, Gary, give me your number. And I said, what's involved with this? How long is it going to take? When do you think we can start? He said, I don't think we can start today, but we can start tomorrow for sure. And we did. And we ran it for 71 days. People would get on that boat in Taylor. That, for your viewers can picture West Quincy, they'd go right down the highway, because that way they didn't run over a signpost or a utility pole. And they went right through the break that had been created in the levee. And we picked them up in front in New Hampshire. People around here are tough, because we don't think of commuting. It takes me about 5 minutes to get to my office. But people got on with their coffee and their newspaper, and they toughed it out. It was really phenomenal. We did that for 71 days. And then we actually had another volunteer site where we went over to West Quincy. The water was receding so slowly, but it got down to where we could line the sides of Highway 24 and pump out. We couldn't get it all off, but you could begin to get trucks through because it was harvest. Yes. And we had to get the beans across the river to Quincy soybean. Yes. And at that point, we opened up the bridge, and we saw what had happened. You know, we'd had all this pent-up demand from nobody being able to get to our retailers in Quincy. And we had the biggest fourth quarter we'd ever had. But it was quite an ordeal, but it was a wonderful thing. You know, going back to that night of July 16th, that was a Friday night, and I mentioned we're trying to figure out what can we do by Monday. Sunday afternoon, we gathered in prayer at Madison Park. Yes. And we're in a circle, and a man did the reading from the Old Testament of Noah and the flood. And I was looking at him, Sherry, and I said, I think I know this guy. And it turned out I had met him. He had a farm up in Indian Grove just north of Quincy. And we'd been out on the levee with Elizabeth Dole. She was head of the Red Cross at the time, and he was there because it was his ground. That had all been flooded. It was underwater, sand in the fields, worst case scenario, lost his crop. And I thought, this guy is now speaking about how God has a plan and how we ought to have faith and come together and trust in the Lord. And his name was Warren Speckhart, and he's become a good friend of mine over the years. He's involved in a lot of the local historical events. He's a former teacher. But it taught me a great lesson. You know, there were so many times when I could have got down, but I got inspired. When Indian Graves broke, we were out there that day, and as I was coming back into Quincy feeling like this is just inexorable, how are we going to fight it? I was coming in 12th Street, and at 12th and Spruce, we had offered anybody that wanted to come to the sandbag site, we'd give them a free bus ride. So here are these two little girls, probably 9 or 10 years old, and they're standing at the bus stop with their shovels. And I thought, they're not giving up.
No way.
So I better not give up. We're just going to keep trying and keep fighting. And I look back on it now, and I see all the blessings. You know, I mentioned that positive portrayal that we got in the national media, very helpful to us. We held in South Quincy Levee District, which has now seen over $500 million of investment by people that want to be on the river, worried about flood protection, come to Quincy. We survived a 500-year flood. But I think most importantly, the way we came together. You know, we now have a Tri-State Development Summit. We started that after the flood because we felt we came together to fight the flood. We can now go forward together. Northeast Missouri, Southeast Iowa. You know, we always had rivalries.
Yes.
And I guess that's natural, but it's a lot of history there, too. Even going back to the Civil War with Illinois and Missouri. Yes. And yet we know if something is going to benefit Canton or Palmyra or Hannibal, well, certainly that's going to be good for Quincy.
Sure.
So that's what we try to do with this summit, is all sit down and we have a common agenda, and together we can do more than we ever could individually. And that was the lesson of the flood of 93.
You know, that was one of the questions I had. What did we do right, and what could we do better? And you've just answered that for us. But I think what you've said is so wonderfully put together, from the thousands of faces that you must have saw on the levee, filling those sandbags, sweat dripping down, because as you said, it was either raining or it was so hot and humid, and it was a very labor-intensive job to fill those sandbags.
One thing I found out is, you know, don't be in the middle, because on the, you know, you're picking them up down here and you're putting them up there. It's better to be up at the top and then you're putting them down on the levee. But you live and learn.
But somebody had to be there.
Somebody's got to be in the middle.
And this is what I found, sir. I found that when one became weary and needed to step back from the line, there was someone to take his place. Absolutely. And that's what community is all about. And ultimately, that's what God is all about, that his Son stepped in for all of us. And you know, through our relationships that we have, you know, you're a man of faith, and you leaned on the confidence that you have in a Savior who gave His all and shows us how. You know, and He was right there to lead us and guide us in all of those ways. It's a matter of a relationship. I've just sat here and heard how you went from source to source to source to source to have help for our community. But the greatest source that we can go to is our Heavenly Father. Absolutely. And I know you must have went to Him minute by minute during that time.
Well, and one of the great lessons of the New Testament is Christ's example that if you want to lead, you have to serve.
Amen. Yes.
You know, He washed the feet of His apostles. Yeah. So that's what public service and public leadership is really all about. You've got to get out there. And, you know, I remember one Monday we were scheduled to have a council meeting. I said, I want to have a council meeting at City Hall. And, you know, we're in the middle of a crisis here. People need us. And so I said, put on some jeans, get some work gloves. We'll have a 5-minute council meeting out at the sandbag site, and then we'll all grab a shovel and go to work. Mm-hmm. I think you have to lead by example, and if you want to lead, clearly you have to be willing to serve, and that's something that Jesus exemplified. So there were a lot of spiritual aspects to the flood. Certainly our churches came together on a non-denominational, ecumenical basis, and oh my gosh, after the flood, so to speak, when the waters receded and we had all this work to do to rebuild, certainly FEMA came in and so forth with the government, but there was so much when the Mennonites showed up from Ohio, and when the World Council of Churches came in and worked with our local churches, but there was so much that people wanted to do to help. All we had to do was provide the opportunity to serve, because people wanted to get out there. In the midst of the heat of the battle, I would walk around the sandbagging site and thank people for coming out. And so many people would look at me and say, no, thank you. We wanted to do something. Now we, you know, as we talked earlier, they probably couldn't go out into a drainage district, certainly not with kids. But they could come out to 17th and 18th and Sycamore there and at the university, and they could find, even if they couldn't fill sandbags, they could find something they could do that could help and help their friends and neighbors and folks they didn't even know.
And that's what it's all about.
Absolutely.
We have about 3 seconds left. Thank you for coming and sharing. And let it be a reminder for all of us to continue to serve. Thank you, and until next time, God bless.
Contact us at Outreach Connection, WTJR 222 North 6th Street, Quincy, Illinois 62301.
Remember this. Cannot change the laws of God. When He has visited you in some form of adversity, and He brings you through that, that's like He has increased the strength of the foundation of your life in your faith in Him.
Hello, I'm Andrew Womack, and I'd like to invite